I genuinely thought that a 17.5-minute move-by-move breakdown of the Adventures of Robin Hood fight would put you all off, and yet here we are.
But since you prefer it this way, you muckrake, why there'll be humour in you.
Indeed, though we aren't going that overboard this week with the stage combat notation. My name is Jill Bearup, and I like pretending to hit people on stage. Something I have done to the point where I can claim the title of actor combatant, though it does tend to bring people out of the woodwork telling me they could beat me in a fight. Yes, lads, obviously, I generally only pretend to hit people. This episode is also sponsored by me. By my book. Last time we talked about the arming sword fight in 1938's The Adventures of Robin Hood between Basil Rathbone and Errol Flynn, and I said, listen, it's a good fight, I like it, it's very well put together, but I do just prefer The Mark of Zorro. I also like The Mark of Zorro movie better than The Adventures of Robin Hood, but I grant you that's mostly personal taste. But I also said that if, hypothetically, you were trying to see whether or not Basil Rathbone's claim that Tyrone Power could have fenced Errol Flynn into a cocked hat had merit, then you couldn't really compare these two fights, because it wouldn't be a fair comparison. However, we do have an example of Basil Rathbone fencing Errol Flynn with fencing swords in 1935's Captain Blood. So, the plot of Captain Blood goeth thusly. Dr. Peter Blood, Irishman who doesn't sound the least bit Irish and former soldier and sailor,
Fought for the French against the Spanish, and the Spanish against the French. I learned my seamanship in the Dutch Navy.
In that cause, we have fought with the Dutch against the Spanish, with the Germans against the French, with the French and Italians against the Germans, and with the French against the Germans and Italians.
I beg your pardon, I don't know how that got in there, has hung up his sword and taken up the lancet, and lives his life generally carefree. That is, until his friend is wounded in the Monmouth Rebellion, also called the Pitchfork Rebellion, and Dr. Blood goes to treat him. Peter is arrested, held for 3 months, tried in the bloody assizes, and sentenced to deportation for treachery against King James II, who until this point Peter Blood really didn't care about very much. When he gets to Jamaica, the governor has gout, which will be important later. But Peter Blood's immediate concerns are slave owner Dixon, who is a total jerk, shockingly, slave owner Bishop, who's not really much better, and slave owner Bishop's niece, Arabella. Dr. Blood refuses to play along at the slave market, which could have gone very badly for him, but then Arabella decides to intervene by buying him.
Your very humble slave, Miss Bishop.
Arabella recommends Peter Blood as the governor's doctor. There's also simmering sexual tension, because it's enemies to lovers, I guess. Sure, why not? Peter decides that escape is an excellent idea and hatches a plan, which they coincidentally try and pull off just as some Spanish pirates arrive to sack Port Royal.
This is what I call a timely interruption. Then what'll come of it, the devil himself only knows.
So Peter and his crew escape and decide to become pirates, because really, what else can you do at this point? Though they do save Port Royal from the Spanish before they go. Captain Blood and his crew get pretty good at this piracy thing, even though they have extra rules compared to usual pirates, like not taking women prisoners, and after stealing a bunch of money, they trot off to Tortuga to spend it for a few months. It is at this point, 1 hour and 9 minutes into the movie, that we meet Captain Levasseur, played by Basil Rathbone, who is going to be doing our sword fighting. Levasseur thinks that he and Captain Blood should team up. Peter is reluctant, but decides to go along with it, and then almost immediately regrets it.
Well, be dead, methinks the greatest captain on the coast has just made the greatest mistake the most ordinary common fool could make.
Also foreshadowing.
Women will be the death of you yet, Levasseur.
Arabella is coming back from England when her ship gets captured, and Levasseur is going to hold her hostage while this guy goes to get the money to pay a ransom. Peter Blood, however, is not down for that, because it is against his articles to take women prisoners, okay? It's against the articles. Never even mind who this particular woman prisoner is. And so Peter buys Arabella according to the rules laid out in the articles, and Captain Levasseur is so incensed that they fight. Levasseur obviously loses. Peter tries to have a tete-a-tete with Arabella on board ship, but they are not good communicators. Then he decides to go and dump her at Port Royal, at great personal risk, because he's mad at her and she's mad at him and he's feeling self-destructively chivalrous, I guess. They go to Port Royal, which is under attack by the French, and they are confused. Where is the British fleet? Well, they are chasing Peter Blood around the Caribbean. Why are the French attacking? Oh, well, you didn't know this, Peter, but William of Orange is now in charge of England. James has been exiled to France, and now France is at war with England. So, hi-ho for England and King Billy, I guess. Let's have a big action scene to save Port Royal, receive our royal pardons, and freedom, and a commission in the King's Navy, and get the girl, and become the governor. The end. I have now mostly managed to exposure therapy my way through the feeling of skin-crawling unease I get whenever Errol Flynn is on the screen. People were very distressed by this, and to that I can only say, listen, It's entirely based on vibes, not facts, and vibes are not admissible in court, particularly when the person in question has been dead for 60 odd years. So I would consider it a kindness if you would stop trying to reason my lizard brain out of something it didn't reason itself into. Nonetheless, we have a nicely constructed sword fight here in the golden age of Hollywood style, and it takes place on the beach. Now, like Anakin Skywalker, I hate sand. I guess it's okay on beaches, but I find it very hard to fight on. I am neither a fast mover nor a particularly skilled fencer. I'm good at doing what I'm told to do, but actual fighting, you know. Rathbone and Flynn, however, acquit themselves very well and very athletically, and so I'm going to run through the fight and name some of the attacks during some of the phrases. And we're going to be using stage combat notation for this, which is quite different to fencing notation, if you've ever used that. So, for the uninitiated, here is my beautiful stickman, Pierce. Or to give him his full title, Count Pierce not Deface, because I asked you for name suggestions and you came through magnificently. So when I'm talking about target areas, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, you will see that they are all numbered on Pierce here. There are more than 5 different parries and various variations of parries that can be done, but in order to get into those, we would have to bring out Pierce's friend Stabitha Christie, and frankly, we're just not there yet. In the meantime,
Do not take her while I live! Then I'll take her when you're dead!
We begin with Levasseur rushing Captain Blood, who parries 3, which is high right, is pushed over, pushes back, and then they get into a more usual on-guard position. And right off the bat, we have established Levasseur as a wrong'un who attacks before his opponent is ready. In the second phrase, we have Levasseur doing some change beats, or counter beats, or circle beats. That's when you beat, which is hit your opponent's blade, but you precede this with a circle underneath, which is some more good character work. Dr./Captain Blood is supposed to be calm and collected and refined. He's very passionate and he feels things very deeply, but he is controlled, whereas Levasseur, well, you know, he's French, I guess, and so he's very passionate and unrestrained, and thus in constant, slightly frantic motion. After some chit-chat,
2 breaches in our articles committed by you should be marooned. It's what I intended for you in the end. But since you prefer it this way, you muckrake, I'll be humouring you.
which is adapted from the novel. Blood beats back, then attacks 4 and is parried, and there is some more dramatic circling. Levasseur attacks 4, 3, Blood attacks 2, Levasseur 3, Blood attacks 2, then 5 with a jump lunge, and Levasseur attacks 1, 5, 2. As I mentioned previously, the athleticism on display here is pretty impressive. Sand is not forgiving. We circle some more, and Levasseur goes back to beating. Steady. Blood attacks 3 and ducks a horizontal head cut, and Arabella looks worried. We've been fairly even up to now, but in the next phrase, Levasseur tries to attack, but Peter Blood is doing most of the offensive work, and Levasseur is looking worried. When Blood lunges in and misses, Levasseur seems to regain a little bit of confidence, and reciprocates with a lunge of his own. And then we head off down the beach with the stunt doubles. Levasseur here is being played by Fred Cavans, who is the fencing master on the film, and Errol Flynn is being doubled by Ralph Faulkner. It's also, even on the Blu-ray, completely beyond me what they're doing. There's definitely a 5 in there and a couple of 2s, and we do 2 90-degree turns so that we can go down the beach and then turn around and go back again. But mostly you can tell this is Faulkner because the hair is just wrong. That is such a terrible wig, honestly. The name Ralph Faulkner, who is also listed on IMDb as the uncredited fight choreographer, may ring a bell if you've watched some of my previous videos, and that is because he was the fencing master on The Court Jester. Not only was he in charge of the fights there, he also ended up doubling for Basil Rathbone because Danny Kaye, while extremely quick and a very fast learner, was not necessarily safe to stage fight at speed against a 60-year-old opponent. But as I said, the fencing master on this film is Fred Cavans, who was also the fencing master on The Adventures of Robin Hood and choreographed the duel in The Mark of Zorro as well. He was also involved in the 1920s silent version of The Mark of Zorro. You know, he was a busy lad. And according to a very interesting article I was reading, which we'll get to later, a lot of the conventions that we might associate with Golden Age Hollywood sword fights are Fred Cavans trademarks. We'll get into some of those in a minute. In the meantime, we leave the stunt doubles and go close in on Basil Rathbone. 2, 3, 2, 3, 2, and then Levasseur attempts a parry 3, but there's no attack. Which is the sort of thing that might get you skewered in a real fight, because it means you are the kind of inexperienced person who is easily lured into patterns. And if you can be lured into a pattern and then your opponent can break that pattern unexpectedly, well, you dead. What follows after they climb the rocks is what Jeff Palmer would refer to as knife sharpening. I found a very interesting article in Volume 1, Issue 1 of The Fight Master, which is the magazine of the Society of American Fight Directors. In it, Jeff Palmer talks about Fred Cavins and the old Hollywood style of sword fighting, which contains a lot of what he calls knife sharpening, which is just diagonal cuts to the head, back and forth and back and forth. It's quite similar to the sword fighting you might see in ballet. It looks very dramatic, and it's easy to transition in and out of if you want to do something else. For example, it's quite easy to transition from the knife sharpening overhead to a fall, which we do here, followed by Captain Blood being unnecessarily fair, followed by a core where no one does anything. Core, where you come together body to body but nobody really does anything unless they're a dastardly villain trying to stab you with a dagger, is a Fred Cavins trademark, and for good reason. It stays true to the genre, which is romantic in the idealized sense, not in the kissy face sense, and it's also good filmmaking. Being core means your actors are in close proximity for a good publicity shot, and it looks dramatic and it plays well on screen, and it gives your audience a moment to catch up with what's been going on. In a real fight, somebody would do something. They'd bite, punch, kick, grab the other person's weapon. There are all manner of things that you can do. But that's not allowed in fencing, and remember that most of the early fight directors were quite literally fencing masters, and so even though they were working with different weapons, and sometimes offhand weapons as well, they thought in fencing terms, which is why they go in straight lines so much. We'll come back to that. See? Romantic. And we contrast it here, after another stunt double section, with Levasseur knocking Blood down and then immediately trying to seize his advantage. But they get up again, more knife sharpening follows, and then the last phrase, which is genuinely really nice. Though admittedly, even with the Blu-ray, I'm having trouble seeing exactly what's going on. We conclude with what I think is a 1-2 from Blood, which is where you go under and then back under, though it may be a double where you go around a couple of times. I genuinely can't see. Levasseur parries this and then does a croisé where he takes Blood's blade from the high line down to the low line, and Blood does a marvellous parry one in response and then immediately follows up with a 5 overhead. Levasseur beats wildly in either direction and then Blood steps offline and just stabs him. Please note how unusual the going offline is, as in stepping out of the straight line in which they have been moving. Because again, the fight directors on these films were fencing masters, and so they naturally thought in fencing kinds of ways, even if they also had to think in cinematic kinds of ways. The combatants circle each other, true, and in the stunt double sections there are a couple of 90-degree turns and we use some rocks and things like that, but generally we move in straight lines when we're fighting. After being stabbed, Basil Rathbone falls into the surf, and you know what? I'll let him tell it. Now what we had to do was this. A man stood with a stopwatch and he timed the waves coming in. There was a short routine in which Flynn had to get me, kill me, and I had to fall just as a wave was coming in. Well, we did it. At the end, all the extras applauded loudly. They were so thrilled at the sheer skill of it because this required beautiful timing, and Flynn and I worked very hard on that sequence. Another thing, you see, if I went into the water and the scene was no good, I would have had to wait until the next day for a new costume. But since they cut away to another angle in the middle of it, you may appreciate the excellent continuity of the waves, but you don't see it as all one shot, even with all that effort. Such is life. And it's a fun fight. It sells Levasseur, who, you may recall, has had very little screen time to this point, as impetuous, immoral, dangerous in a loose cannon kind of way, but ultimately no match for Peter Blood's controlled ferocity. Levasseur is very much not the main villain in the film, but he is there to provide piratical shenanigans. Now, do I like this better than the Mark of Zorro fight? No, but again, that's a personal taste thing. I appreciate it for what it does, because it works magnificently. It also has different requirements and limitations to the Mark of Zorro fight. For example, it's a pirate movie. You're on a beach. You have to keep as much of the scenery in shot as possible. You're also fighting on sand, and Errol Flynn is very much not a fencer, and this is the first movie in which he is going to be doing any fencing, and so you want to keep the technically demanding moves to a minimum. But that works from a character perspective because they're fighting as pirates on sand, even if Peter Blood is an experienced soldier/sailor. Two fencing experts fighting each other in a flat room should look more polished. And when it comes right down to it, I am quite partial to a bit of knife sharpening sometimes. Is it historically accurate? Nah, probably not. Does it look dramatic? Yes. Yes, it does. And sometimes that's all you really need. Having watched all of these fights, I'm fairly confident in saying that Basil Rathbone was indeed correct and that Tyrone Power was a better fencer than Errol Flynn. But both of them made it look good. And frankly, That's all you need. This episode is still sponsored by me. If you would like to buy my book, I would probably watch the series first, which I will link up here, as well as another Golden Age Hollywood sword fight. Because if you don't enjoy the video, you probably won't enjoy the book. But if you do enjoy the video, odds are pretty good that you will enjoy the book. Thanks for watching. See you soon.